Hi there, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shallwalker, your host, and today we are going to be going over the new album from Iron Maiden, Senjutsu. The last record Iron Maiden put out came out in 2015 and had some pretty solid tracks on it. It did suffer under its own weight a bit, and I was hoping that whatever Iron Maiden put out next would be a little bit more concise and less bloated, but here we are in 2021 with this new, very long-winded album. To be fair, I have been very excited to listen to this record. While it may have been a bit bloated, and while it may be a bit bloated, it absolutely has its share of excellent songs and great writing. The lead single off of this record, The Writing on the Wall, caught my attention on the very first listen, and is probably one of the best late-era Maiden songs to date. The first track we have is the title track, Senjutsu, which is about an 8-minute long track that kicks off the record with a very promising chugging riff and pulsing drums. Bruce Dickinson is showing his age a little bit here in his vocal delivery, but considering how good he still is, it sounds pretty impressive. I mean, his delivery is pretty much on point for what you would expect, compared to even their old material. The thing that really leaves me scratching my head here is that in this track there's kind of these very garish synths that kind of fill the backing track during some of the more tense moments on the song, and they become increasingly abrasive over the duration of the track. It makes a really relatively decent Maiden song a very difficult listen to enjoy, which is a shame, as this is one of the better written songs on this album from, just that writing standpoint. The next song we get in this album is the second single for this record, Stratego. This track is exactly the kind of straight-to-the-point classic heavy metal style track that Iron Maiden knows how to nail pretty much every time. I've always kind of maintained that Iron Maiden is one of those bands that do one thing really well, and this is a prime example of the excellent trick they got in action. They do a fantastic backflip, basically. However, the incredible invasive synths return in this track, and while they may not be as awful or out of place as they are in the first song, they're still a little bit of a baffling addition here, and seem to be more than unnecessary. Other than that, this is one of the better written songs here. Onto what I would consider the darling child of this album, The Writing on the Wall. In my opinion, this is a contender for the best Maiden song that has been put out in basically the last decade or so, and I would say could easily hold up against their 80s output. The acoustic intro sounds fantastic, and the build-up that this track has is wonderful. Dickinson's voice is at its best on this track and plays off of the instrumentals brilliantly. As far as a song that would be considered a crowd pleaser, I can definitely see this one becoming a live staple for Maiden. The next track we have is Lost in a Lost World. This one kind of starts to lose me a little bit with a fairly long track length that doesn't necessarily go down many interesting sonic paths. The intro is pretty decent, but suffers a bit from an overproduced vocal track that is way too echo and reverb heavy, though the performance itself from Dickinson is fine. Once the intro segment lets up, we get a very standard Maiden riff that is unfortunately on the lower end of quality as far as the writing is concerned. There is a bit of a lack of originality here that they seem to be trying to kind of hide behind more questionable production choices throughout this song. It's not really an awful track, as there is some really good stuff in here, like the solo work and the vocal work in the outro are really great. But overall, it is quickly forgettable, which is almost worse than it just being outrightly, bad. The next track is Days of Future Past. This one is another of the shorter tracks with a bit of a higher pace than the last song. This one also reaching back into the Maiden catalog for inspiration, with some hints of, some Power Slave and Somewhere in Time blended into this sort of modern translation of that sound. By this point in the album, the obnoxious synth work becomes a bit less immediately noticeable, as there is such an abundance of it on this album, which is, still in my opinion a shame, but at least at this point in the record, you can kind of, ignore it a bit, and it kind of helps me focus back in on the writing here, which is pretty high tier as far as Maiden goes. It's the same one good trick that they're well known for, and they do it very, very well here. Next up, we've got The Time Machine, a kind of warm-up for the marathon of long songs that is the second half of this album. This song, ramping up at 7 or so minutes, we get a slow acoustic and vocal intro that heads into a weird kind of drum beat that doesn't really quite sound like a standard 4/4 beat. It's kind of like they're making a little play on the title with some slightly offbeat time signatures. It's certainly not prog rock territory, but for Maiden it's just off enough to seem like a little weird. But it is pretty nicely done. The theatrics on this one are very ramped up as well, and make this one a relatively fun listen. The vocal work from Bruce is stellar as usual. There's also a very cool effect-heavy guitar solo on this track that is really, really fresh, compared to a lot of the other Maiden solos. There's a lot of very neat things that I don't know if they've necessarily used, certain effects that are a bit new for their playbook, that kind of blend a lot of the old Maiden style for kind of a sharpened edge for this recording. This may be one of the better non-single tracks on the album, if not the best. The next track we have is Darkest Hour, just slightly longer than the last song. We get some sampled ocean sounds and a slow kind of arpeggio guitar intro with even more synths, cue dramatic buildup, and Dickinson taking the spotlight for the next several minutes. The song kind of toys with you, making you think the pace is going to pick up, but it's honestly quite slow for the majority of the track. It's a bit hard to plod through, and there's a lot of fat that could have been trimmed on this song. At this point in the album, things start getting a bit exhausting, and I'm not sure why. So many artists kind of fall into this trap of long songs equal better songs, but but Iron Maiden have completely fallen for that idea for whatever reason. It's the same thing that happened to Tool in 2019. People seem to love this idea of an album of epics, but that really just undermines the quality of every track if they are all uniform in that kind of way. There needs to be some sort of variety here, as the quality of the writing suffers noticeably the further into this album you get. Next up is Death of the Celts. At just over 10 minutes long, this is another collection of excellent ideas stretched way too thin. It seems like Maiden wants to be known for these very ambitious tracks that maybe call back to songs like Alexander the Great or Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Songs that are quite long in their own right, and both of those songs are fantastic tracks. I think that's probably just because the albums that those songs are on are mostly filled with shorter tracks. Ideally, this song could have been about 6 to 8 minutes at the most, but it probably should have just, been left on the cutting room floor, if I'm being honest. The lyrical storytelling, for the most part, is pretty good, but it can't really save this song from its own weight. The second to last track is the Parchment, the longest song on the album, sitting around 12.5 minutes, has a slightly more justifiable track length, as it seems like a lot of the focus on the writing went into this song. While it still absolutely could be trimmed down a bit, it is a significant step in the right direction. Sonically, this track is reaching back a bit to a kind of Powerslave-esque tone that is sure to be a fan pleaser. I'm mad that this track is pretty unfocused, honestly, and spends way too much time kind of meandering during every segment of the song, despite the higher writing quality of the riffs and the lyrics. I mean, they are just so goddamn repetitive at a certain point in a very, very short amount of time. The entire middle segment of this track could pretty much be scrapped. It does not need to be here. And honestly, the song will be a lot better for it. This just needs to be more focused. The final track on the album is Hell on Earth, another mammoth of a song at 11 minutes. When the intro of this song starts, I'm very hopeful that this maybe isn't a waste of time at this point, but 2 whole minutes into the song with not a goddamn thing happening kind of leaves me defeated. And then it happens. Maiden, build a proper build and release for an excellent galloping riff that actually catches my attention. Dickinson's vocals are almost pretty when he comes in with a kind of steady grace. Despite the very slow intro, this is a fantastic album closer, and I am so very glad that there is something at least decent here on this other bottom half of the record. I still think this hour and 20-minute long album could probably have been condensed to about 40 to 50 minutes and be a top-notch record, but despite the weak points in this album, there's really still, a fair amount of enjoyable moments here, and there are a few noteworthy tracks. With that being said, the amount of filler and fluff done on this album, I would say that, this is, a solid 5 from me. I just wish that things were a bit more focused. Thank you all so much for watching. Happy Labor Day. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and drop a like on the video. I love making these videos for you guys and would love to get more videos to all of you. Thank you all again, and we will see you on the flip side.